All right, it's the top of the hour, so let's get started. So welcome to this program, How to Get Someone to Talk Candidly and Non-Defensively About Difficult Issues. Just to give you a quick background, this actually started off as a follow-up webinar for attendees of a presentation that I gave at a conference recently titled Let's Talk for a Change. And we didn't get a chance to go into as much depth in the what I call the invitation of the declaration invitation process. And so I promised to do a follow-up webinar. Then I decided I would open it up to my general list. So what we'll be doing is both the declaration invitation. So folks that had been at that seminar, or if you've been to previous seminars of mine on constructive conversations, we'll do a brief review of the declaration part before launching into the invitation because, as I'm sure you know from learning, it's always helpful to do a review. So if you have questions, okay, there we go. Okay, if you have questions, there is the handy question box there. And if you hear any barking in the background, that will be Minnie, the blind min pin rescue dog, doing this out of my home office. Hopefully she won't be yapping away. So, foundational principle, every better result you want requires having a better conversation. And that's really the underpinning of a lot of the work that I do. So, when I think about important conversations, I think of these 4 critical moments of truth. What you do before the conversation, how you begin the conversation, then once the conversation has begun, how you respond to the other person, so the during, and then what do you do after. The after moment of truth is more related to if it's a performance management conversation. But we're going to focus on the second moment of truth, how you begin the conversation, because this is what I promised in the follow-up. And it's also, I think also it's where you get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of getting you started on making this work. That being said, what I found over the years, if you don't do rock solid before the conversation work, the conversation won't begin on the right foot. But again, this will give you the most actionable information in a short amount of time. So the beginning moment of truth, the question is, how can I send an inviting message? So an inviting message opens the door to a productive conversation. So think of it as this little gentleman knocking on your door with flowers, or this is actually a woodchuck that arrived on my door several years ago. So how do you open the door to making the conversation work? So an inviting message is, number one, it creates emotional safety. This is critical. There's a saying that I heard from Martha Beck saying that when people act in scary ways, it's probably because they're scared. And so when people get defensive, antagonistic, combative, they're not willing to acknowledge their culpability or their mistake, it's probably because they don't feel safe. So it's so mission critical to create emotional safety. The next piece about an inviting message is it uses the least amount of power and intensity to get the point across. Oftentimes people, especially with strong personalities, really overkill when they bring up an issue, and it puts the person on the defensive. Oh, by the way, I just noticed I wanted to mention, if you see the page numbers on the bottom right, this is actually excerpted from the day-long program, and that refers to the manual that goes with it. So an inviting message communicates an openness to discuss. This is also critical, so the person doesn't feel like they're about to be lectured to or scolded. And it avoids blaming, judging, scolding, criticizing, and psychoanalyzing. So we'll go into a little more depth about the opposite of doing that. Oh, by the way, I will send you the PDF of these slides. So what I encourage you to do is jot down notes related to thoughts that pop into your mind, and don't worry about scurrying to write this down. An inviting message also avoids mostly emotionally charged words and phrases. The dreaded, you should have or you shouldn't have done that, which is, immediately triggers defensiveness. You made me upset. You offended me. You were unprofessional. Those you statements, again, guaranteed to trigger defensiveness. And always and never. Actually, I'm going to open this up to questions. In that question box, let's see who the first smart person is. Why does it trigger defensiveness in people if you say, you always have to be right, or you never listen to me? Go ahead and jot down, why does using always or never, why is that pretty much a guarantee that it triggered defensiveness? So waiting for some smart person to weigh in. I'll wait 20 more seconds. Wait, okay, because it's never true. All right. It just says Chris, so that would be, let's see, way to go, Krista, you got it. Yeah, because always and never statements are never true, because nobody always or never does anything. And so, all right, another Jamie, I think it says Jamie, because it's an absolute statement. You got it. And what that does when we make those sort of absolute, all-encompassing statements that intuitively a person knows can't be true, it triggers the innate aversion to injustice. Okay, a little bit of human nature factoid there. Inviting message also avoids inflammatory phrases like, it seems like that would be a no-brainer, or you really offended me, or why did you throw me under the bus? I actually had somebody say that to me. Or I was telling a story actually at a seminar, and he said, why did you throw that person under the bus? And it was funny because I immediately found myself, despite my best intentions, getting defensive because I didn't feel like I did. Obviously it felt like an attack. Hello. Okay. So those types of words. So when you're thinking about how am I going to bring up this issue, to be thinking about when you choose the language to strip out anything that could be inflammatory. All right, so let's do the declaration invitation. So again, we'll do the declaration part quickly. And again, you're going to get the PDF of the slides. So the declaration is clear, concise, and concrete, and therefore easily understood. Another aspect of human nature, and think about this from your own experience, when people are confused, it triggers frustration and then often aggression. And the reason for that is confusion triggers the innate feeling of helplessness. Because if you're confused, you don't know what to do in a situation. And that's why it's so important to get feedback from somebody who really knows what they're doing, a smart colleague, a trusted advisor, etc., to find out if how you're going to bring up the issue is clear and understandable. And so the declaration. So the declaration invitation, the declaration is where you declare, here's what I want to talk about, here's the issue. And then the invitation is when you invite them into the conversation. So sorry, I forgot to mention that part. So what else? It gives you a person enough context, but not a long story. So what you bring up doesn't sound like it's out of the blue. One of the examples I oftentimes use in my seminars is this. We were brainstorming a group of managers. I was working with a group of managers about how to bring up an issue with one of his direct reports where it was a man who did great work, but he often came in late. And so I said, how would you bring up the conversation? And this one guy said, I would start off by saying, so how do you like working here? And you think that if you were the employee, that probably wouldn't make you feel particularly safe or comfortable. So you want to give a little bit of backstory, if you will, but very, very little bit, so the person knows what you're talking about. Also, as another way of saying about an inviting message, using the least amount of intensity required to get the point across. If they still don't get the point across, then you can dial up the intensity. But there's that Geico commercial where they quote a Chinese proverb, don't remove the fly from a friend's forehead with an axe. It might be a way to get rid of the fly, but it's kind of rough on the friend. And so a lot of people use that, or as a hatchet or an axe or a 2x4, when just a light touch will do the trick. So also, critical having a welcoming or at least neutral tone of voice. If it's really hard for you to get to welcoming and kindly, then at least go for neutral. Because, as you know, the tone of voice has a profound impact on people's emotional response. In fact, another little factoid related to human nature, the same part of the brain that processes emotion processes voice tone. So that's why it's important. Let's say you're really annoyed at somebody. That's why it's really important to vent with a trusted friend to get the annoyance or the anger or the resentment out of your system. So when you talk with the person, that annoyance or resentment or anger doesn't spill over and leak through the communication, because that will only trigger defensiveness and antagonism in them. State your experience or perspective without blame or judgment. So describe what you experienced or what you thought you saw without labeling the person as bad, unprofessional, a loser, inconsiderate, etc. So without telling this long story, when I do the day-long seminar, I use an example from a conversation that I had with a coworker years ago, where he said two really incredibly rude and borderline verbally abusive things to me in a meeting. I was a pretty new employee there, and was really shocked. I was afraid that this was the typical way people related in the company. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. And so I decided that I would address it with him. And so my first thought was to, say something that was very judging and scolding, because it was incredibly unprofessional, incredibly rude, etc. And even though I might have been right in being blaming and judgmental, it wouldn't have made for a productive conversation. And so my declaration part of the conversation, or the declaration invitation, the declaration part, when I brought it up, went like this. I don't know if you remembered in yesterday's meeting when you said A and B, the two things that he said. So I immediately, I set the context. I'm sure you were just trying to be funny, but being on the receiving end, it didn't feel real funny. So I shared very briefly my own experience. Now you notice I said it didn't feel real funny. That was as vulnerable and open as I was willing to be with this man, given his track record. I'd seen him be really rude and verbally abusive to others. So I wasn't about to be as open and vulnerable as I would to a friend. So that's an example of stating your experience or perspective without blame or judgment. I'm just going to quickly check to see if there's any questions. Okay, no questions. If you have a question, feel free to put that in the box. I'll jump on the question box every now and then. Okay. So let's give you a couple examples. So here's an example. Kyle, I'd like to talk with you about how we can improve the way our team works together. So that's the goal. That you immediately say, here's the goal. What I mean by that is, and then you'd give a concrete example. Okay, so that would be an example of a declaration. This is obviously a longer one. So I'm concerned with what's been going on with our team and marketing lately. We really need to improve how our departments work together, and I wanted to get your thoughts about how we could do that. So that's actually a declaration invitation, really. I want to get your thoughts about how we can do that. So you're inviting the person into the conversation. Okay, quickly check the questions. No questions. Okay. So now that's the declaration. The invitation invites the person into the conversation. It asks them for their point of view, their reaction to what you said, an answer to your question, asks them to help you understand something that happened. So you notice it's inviting them into a dialogue, so you don't turn it into a monologue. It communicates, I want you to speak honestly and openly with me, and it's safe to do so. So here's some examples of, so after you do the declaration, you might say the invitation, so I was wondering where you were coming from about that. Or, do you know what I mean? Or, whoops, so I wanted to see if we could talk about it. Or, so what's your take on it? So you notice these are just simple little phrases that invite the person into a dialogue, into a conversation. And let me ask you this, why don't you want here's a question. I'll answer this question before I ask my question. Can a declaration invitation be effective if made via email? Great question, Pete. Yes. It takes real skill, and here's the rule of thumb that I use. If I'm concerned that if I bring up the issue, even if I give some context, if I bring up the issue, if I'm concerned it'll feel so all out of the blue to the person that it will stun them, which will trigger a negative response. Those of you who've been to my programs, you know I talk about downshifting, which to those of you who haven't, basically downshifting is something that happens to the human brain when people feel threatened, feel stressed in any measurable way. And when people get downshifted, they lose the higher brain functioning. And what's called the reptilian brain, this really primitive part of the brain, kicks into gear. And so the last thing you want to do is trigger downshifting in another person. And one of the ways of triggering downshifting is catching a person off guard. So there have been a few times in my life, both personally and professionally, where I've introduced a topic via email, but I was really careful not to weigh in on, here's how I'm seeing it or here's how I feel about it. Simply a very neutral, benign, hey, I wanted to see if we could talk about such and such and, get your take on it. So making it very neutral is especially important. So thanks for that question. Let me ask you this question. Why do you want to do an invitation to dialogue as quickly as possible versus go on some long, drawn-out declaration? So I'll wait 20 minutes and see what people come up with. And even if you don't write something in, I want you to think about it because it's critical to being good at this stuff. Waiting. Okay, here we go. Krista, right. So that the two of you can engage in solutions together. Fantastic. And the other person isn't going to feel like they have even the opportunity to collaborate on a solution if they feel like it's a monologue. So they can recall the facts of the situation. All right, Pete. So giving them a chance, both for their own sake, to recall what it is you're talking about, but also maybe to fill you in on some things that you're not aware of. So thanks, guys. Also, here's another piece of human nature that's really helpful when you think about what do I need to do to engage people or, engage Joe in this conversation. I know Joe gets defensive real easily or it's a tough subject, is this aspect of human nature. When people feel helpless, when the people don't feel like they have a measure of control in a situation, it triggers that downshifting phenomenon I talked about. And so when people get downshifted, not only do they become more primitive in their response, well, let me say it a different way. When people downshift, they become more immature. And actually, I'm going to share with you a resource page which has a short video describing this process. not only do people become more immature as they downshift, but also they literally become more primitive in their thought process. And so, because if people don't feel like they have some kind of control in a situation, if they feel helpless, it triggers this primal fear that if I'm helpless, I will soon be dead. Now, you notice I said primal, so it's not at a conscious level. So if you go on and let's say unfairly accuse somebody of something and they don't get a chance to say their point, they're not feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to get killed now. But at an unconscious level, that helplessness of I'm not getting a chance to say my point of view is triggering this fear of I'm out of control, I will soon die, which triggers downshifting. If you have any questions about downshifting, you can put that in the question box. So, okay. So this is what I promised with extra special promise at the conference. These two language patterns that are part of the invitation that I call worth their weight in gold language patterns. And the reason why I say that is because when you know how to do them well, they are so good at making it safe for people to acknowledge issues that they would not ordinarily acknowledge because either it would feel too embarrassing or because there was a power differential or is a power differential. So whether, let's say, you're the manager and it's a direct report, that maybe unless they're really assertive, they're unlikely to bring up, boss, you micromanage and it drives me nuts. Or, it really bothers me that, I worked overtime, 3 nights this week and you never even bothered to say thank you. Think about your own experience of something like that. It would just feel so awkward and weird to say something like that. Yet it still bothers you. And actually, let me encourage you to think about, in your own life, relationships, both personally and professionally, where there are things that the other person has done that's bothered you, but it's like, it's just not worth bringing it up. You got to pick your battles. Well, these two language patterns make it more likely that the other person will bring up the issue that's bothering them versus holding a resentment, or versus what I think happens a lot in the workplace is when employees don't feel safe enough to bring up an issue. Instead, what happens is they feel a little less excited about working really hard, a little less committed to going the extra mile. And think about that in your own experience. Hasn't that happened? So here are the language patterns. And I will give you 2 examples of mention the unmentionable. But first, let me give you the concept. Mentioning the unmentionable means, pretty much as it says, it means mentioning some potential issue that the other person probably won't bring up because either it's too awkward or the power differential. So let me give you the workplace example. And actually, I'll give you 2 examples in the next format. So workplace example that I use in my seminars, because most people can relate to either being on either or both sides of this equation, is the performance management performance review. And let's say I have my performance review with my direct report, Tiffany. And I try to be really tuned into Tiffany and look at her nonverbals, and she seems fine. There was some critical feedback that I gave her, and I gave her just a meets expectation in most things, no exceeds. And at the end of the conversation, and I try to do my best engaging her in conversation, but she doesn't say a whole lot. At the end of the conversation, I ask her if she has anything she wants to say, and she says no. So, based on the data that I'm getting, I guess it went well. But let's say a week goes by, and I notice that Tiffany's not her usual chipper, cheery self. She seems kind of morose, kind of withdrawn. So I want to check in with how she's doing. And I have a feeling it might be because of the performance review. And so I could just say, hey, Tiffany, how are things going? And chances are Tiffany will say, oh, they're fine, because what is she going to say? She doesn't really know how serious I am, how sincere I am. Am I just being generically courteous? Now let's say, so that's the most vague, least likely to get any honest, candid feedback or input from Tiffany. Now let's say, if I say, hey, Tiffany, hey, I just want to check how you're doing. I might be imagining things, but you seem kind of bummed out late this last week. You don't seem your typical chipper self. Are you okay? So that shows more sincere interest, and that I'm basing it on something that I'm noticing. So that's a more compelling invitation. Now, what about if I say this? If I say, Tiffany, I want to, I don't know if I'm just imagining things, but you haven't been your typical chipper self this week. And I started wondering if, maybe I'm imagining things, but I started wondering if it had anything to do with our performance review. If maybe, you're upset about that. That's mentioning the unmentionable. Now, let me ask you, what does asking that question and putting out there about, I'm wondering if it's something about the performance review, how is that different, and what does it do differently and better than just saying either, hey, how's it going, or, you don't seem yourself as anything going on? So I'm going to wait 20 seconds. And so go ahead and put in the question box. So we're waiting. Okay, you've got something. Okay, what do we have here? All right, Bobby, it gets the topic on the table for discussion. Perfect. Okay, here's another one. Way to go, Bobby. This is... also puts them in a position to lie if they don't want to be honest. Okay. So I'll address that. Oh, okay. Oh, I see there's more to it. Sorry, Krista. It invites someone to engage, but it also puts them in a position to lie if they don't want to be honest. Let me address that. So the first thing, because it puts it on the table, it communicates it's okay to talk about it. With just saying, is everything okay? I'm not communicating to Tiffany that I'm cool about talking about the performance review and her upsetness about it. But if I explicitly say that, then she gets the message, okay, I guess he's okay to talk about it. Let's see. Just one second, Pete. Thanks for this question. I'll answer that in a second, and let me get to Krista. Kristen said it also gives them the opportunity to lie if they don't want to be honest. Sometimes that's a question or a concern that I get in seminars when I talk about this. And while it's possible that somebody could lie, it's not a issue. Well, it is an issue because I don't want somebody lying. But it's not a game changer because this is just like your opening gambit, so to speak. This is just bringing up the issue so then you can discuss it. And so let's say the person says, yes, that's what it's about. Then, okay, then you'll explore it with them. And hopefully, if you continue to explore it with them in a way that fosters emotional safety, hopefully they will come around and become more honest. Let's say that they don't become honest. It's okay, because what it still does is it puts the issue out on the table and sort of like puts the person on notice. I'm thinking this is going on, so you say it's not going on. Okay. But it's on my mind. And so they know that it's on your mind. I will give you an example. One of the other concerns people voice, especially for this next language pattern, is that it gives somebody a pre-made excuse. And I'll give you my point of view on that. Okay, and Pete, let's see, what did you say here? Do you always leave an out, as in maybe I'm imagining? Okay. I don't know, back to always and never. I don't think I always or never do anything, but I try to make it clear if I'm thinking I'm seeing something, to make it clear that I get it, that it's an inference I'm making. Because if I say, I see you're upset, or I see you're, the last thing you want to say, I see you're getting defensive, I see you have issues with such and such, that's either borderline or psychoanalyzing. Anytime we tell somebody what they're experiencing, it can trigger downshifting because it's invasive. It's saying, I know what's going on in you. Now, if we see something on the exterior, so their facial expression, their body language, etc., looks like they're upset, I think it's a judgment call whether, I guess you could say you seem upset. Yeah, something like that. At the risk of belaboring this point, if we point out too much what people are displaying non-verbally, it can trigger shame. And shame gets triggered by exposure. So if you want more about that, you can Google shame and exposure, and it can go into more depth. As much as I love that whole issue, because it really affects conversations and relationships, this isn't the place, but it'll help speak to more why we want to be pretty thoughtful when we comment on somebody else's reaction. So that's mentioning the unmentionable. So it's bringing up something that the other person isn't going to mention. Now, the second language pattern is what I call the multiple choice opener. And oftentimes, this is actually, even though I call it an opener, is actually a follow-up to the mention the unmentionable. And actually, I'll give you an example of when it's a follow-up and when it's an opener. So here's an example of the follow-up with the performance review scenario that I already used. So let's say Tiffany. So I say, maybe I'm imagining it, but you seem your typical chipper self, wondering if something's going on, and then I started wondering if it had anything to do with a performance review that we had. So, and then let's say Tiffany says, well, actually, let's say Tiffany goes, no, everything's fine. Then I'm not going to badger her. I'm simply going to say, oh, okay. Just know if, hopefully it's clear if at any time that you are upset about something, my door is always open, especially if it has anything to do with, an interaction that we had. And so I just leave the door open. But let's say she says, well, yeah, now that you mention it, I am pretty bummed out about the performance review. Okay. Now, what about if I say this? Thanks, Tiffany. I appreciate your being honest with me. I can understand why it's not fun to get negative feedback in a performance review. So, I can understand that. Now, what about if I respond that way? And I think I'm like just rocking the empathy. What's maybe not so great about that response? If you can put your response in the questions. Or you can even ask a question too. So, what's not so great with saying, I can understand why it would be hard, because it's never easy for any of us to get negative feedback. Looking for responses. There we go. All right, Pete. Okay. Okay. Man, we got some. Okay. You're assuming you understand. And then this is Krista. That may not be the aspect of the performance review that she is upset about. You've assumed you know what it's about. All right, way to go, Pete and Krista. You guys are rocking it. Exactly. I'm assuming like that's what it is. And it can be even more infuriating to Tiffany, because I've sort of like closed the door on any other interpretation of the of the event. And it also sounds a little condescending, sort of like, it sucks to be you kind of comment. So we obviously don't want that. So here's what the multiple choice opener would be. And it's a little longer. I wish I could do it more in a shorter way, but it's a pretty thorough response. So here goes. So multiple choice would be, I really appreciate your being straightforward with me, Tiffany. I'm curious. You're being upset about the performance review. Is it because it's never fun for any of us to get negative feedback, or is it more about you disagree with some of the feedback, or is it more about the way it was delivered, or something else? You notice the format. It's a multiple choice. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Or is it something else? Now, what's different about saying, I'll say it one more time. So I'll just do the multiple choice. Is it because, it's not fun for any of us to get negative feedback, or is it more because you disagree with some of the feedback? You think it was inaccurate, or was it more, you agree with the feedback, but you felt the way it was delivered wasn't particularly helpful, or is it something else? So you notice it's like, is it this, is it this, is it this, or something else? Now, notice how, just as with mentioning the unmentionable, by throwing those possible reasons out, it makes it explicit. It's cool to talk about these things. Versus if I just said, I appreciate your, being, open about that. What aspect of it is bothering you? Now, there's nothing wrong with that question. That's a great open-ended question, but it doesn't communicate explicitly. It's okay to talk about these really touchy issues. And actually, I remember years ago sharing this with a team, and the president of the company saying, I just can't imagine asking that question. And when I asked her, like, really? How come? She said, I don't know, I just can't. And it was clear with her defensive response that, pressing the issue wasn't going to, create a productive conversation, but it speaks to me, number one, is how fearful people are oftentimes, even, and this person had a really strong personality, about opening up conversation, and also how, and I really respected this, and still do, this president, really sharp person who really cared about her people, but even really sharp, caring people oftentimes have real room for improvement on how to make it safe for people to bring up difficult issues. And just sort of an FYI that I in seminars I often say this could be the area that you can make the biggest difference in your life by you modeling how to be somebody that makes it safe for for people to talk about vulnerable issues, not only do you get better results, but also you model for other people how they can do it with other people. So, any questions about the difference between doing a multiple choice before I give you another example versus just saying, what about it bothered you? I'll just wait 20 seconds to see if there are any questions. And as I'm waiting, I want to make one other a point that's clarifying. It relates to something that either you, Pete, or Krista, you mentioned, which is one of the other things that's really powerful about the multiple choice opener is that it's sort of related to helping people clear up or get clear in their mind the events. Also, haven't you noticed that when you're upset about something, it's hard for you to sometimes get really clear on what precisely about it you're upset? It's just you're aware of your feelings are hurt, or it doesn't feel fair, or something's off. And oftentimes when somebody says, boy, it sounds like you're upset about this as opposed to this, is that true? You're like, yeah, that's what the real issue is. And so putting words to the various potential issues also helps clarify their thought process, because Tiffany in the example might be thinking, I don't agree with this feedback. But then when she hears the choices, she finds herself thinking, well, to be honest, I think his feedback's accurate. I just feel like he bludgeoned me with it. So what did Krista say? I think that something else is critical. Otherwise, it looks once again like you understand something that you may not. Yes, is it something else is hugely important in communicating. I don't assume I know what's going on with you. Perfect call. One of the other you're mentioning that, Krista, makes me think of something else, is one of the other benefits of the multiple choice opener is you think about when I ask, is it this, is it this, is it this, it's communicating, I put a lot of thought into this, which communicates to Tiffany, I care about you and I care about my impact on you. Okay. So let me give you a few examples, and then we will, any closing questions, and then we'll wind up. So examples of the declaration invitation format. So I'd like to talk with you about how we can, whatever the goal is, how we can, our teams can work better together. What do you think we could do to make that happen? That's like the one I said before. I'd like to get your take on whatever the issue is that you're concerned about. Here's my concern, and then state the concern. What's your take on it? So you get to the point, you talk about what it is you want to talk about, you share your perspective, and then you invite them in. Or, I'd really like it if we could state the goal. What do you think about that? So short and sweet. And obviously you fill in the blank with state the goal. You don't say, I'd really like to state the goal. Bill, I wanted to talk with you about, describe the specific situation that happened. So I'd really like to talk with you about how our department didn't get the product in time to meet our customer contract. Can you help me understand what you were thinking? Maybe that's not the best what we were thinking. Can you help me understand what happened in that situation? So, Bill, I wanted to talk with you about in the meeting when we were brainstorming ideas on how to create a more compelling webinar. You said, we can't talk about the webinar anymore. We need to talk about other stuff. Can you help me understand where you were coming from about that? So, we're on the home stretch here. And last but not least, poor Bill. Bill, I wanted to talk with you about, describe the specific situation that happened. Can you help me understand what was going on? Okay. So, we focused in this webinar on the second of the 4 critical moments of truth. There's 3 others. And as I mentioned before, doing the work before you have the conversation will make or break whether the conversation goes well. And obviously not all conversations you can prepare for. Some you have to have on the fly. But just like practicing a sport or a martial art, the more you practice in practice, the better you perform when you're in a more high pressure, anxiety producing situation. So as far as next steps, I've got a page for you, and you're welcome to share this. This is for people who've attended programs of mine. So some of the articles you can reinforce what we covered here. You're welcome to share this with your colleagues. And I've got a bunch of audios and then that you're welcome to download. There's 2 more, I think. This is just a piece of the page. Let's Talk for a Change. That was a keynote that I did at an event. And it actually describes the downshifting process and what to do before you have the conversation process. And when you get the handouts, you can just click that link. Oh, wow, that's quite the little animation. So feel free to reach out and ask questions, or if you're interested in coaching or training on this topic, there's all the scoop. So before we close up, I just want to see, does anybody have any closing questions? And how about that? We're ending early. How about you? But webinars sometimes seem like they take forever, so I am really pumped for you that it's not a full hour. I mean, it's interesting. If you've given webinars, they go by really fast, but as a participant, it sometimes seems like they go on forever. So, any closing questions about anything I talked about or anything related to your particular scenario? Okay, here we go. All right. Pete, are there special considerations in these approaches for employees needing to talk to supervisors? Oh, yes. Great question. Proceed with caution. And this is where especially not triggering downshifting the other person comes into play. And especially if your supervisor or manager is really an old school command and control person, or they have a really strong personality. So for instance, I used to work for a supervisor who, those of you who know the DISC profile, was an off-the-chart D, so a driver, a director, high need for dominance. So I was very clear if I would bring up something to her to make it clear that I wasn't trying to challenge her or say she was wrong, but to share my perspective. So you can even say, I know you're the boss here, so you get to decide, but I'd really appreciate it if you could hear my point of view. It's also, that's, even though I always recommend to people, run your declaration invitation by somebody who knows their stuff, somebody you respect, to get feedback on, any tweaks you might need. I especially recommend it if you're managing up. So thanks for that question, Pete. Any other questions? Does not look like there are any other questions. So thanks for being part of this. Again, I will send you out the slides in PDF form, and you're welcome to re-listen to the webinar or share it with your colleagues. If you want an on-site version of this, just email me and we shall talk. So thanks again, and hope to talk with you later. Take care. Bye.